Dead Rising. That's a name you probably haven't heard of in a long time. The game was created by Capcom, way back when the Xbox 360 had just made its way into the mainstream market with its Halo game series. The concept for Dead Rising was originally supposed to be a follow-up to the game Shadow of Rome, which was an alternate fictionalized version of the assassination of Julius Caesar. But the development crew wanted to make something that would appeal more to the Western market, and on that day, Dead Rising was born. This game was such a success on the Xbox 360 that it made its way to platinum hits and spawned so many sequels and spin-off games, which we'll talk a little bit about in this video. This video will mainly focus on Dead Rising and give you a little bit of details as to where the franchise is at and why I hope this remake that they're working on is going to fix all of the previous mistakes that the franchise made, especially with Dead Rising 4. I want to talk about this game because this game is just so amazing, and it's almost 20 years old now and it still has such a huge dedicated fan base. There have always been rumors circulating around that Capcom is working on a reboot of the franchise, and we actually just got a remake trailer a couple days ago. We don't really know what that means for the rest of the franchise and whether or not the rest of the franchise will get the same kind of touch-up, but I do want to talk about what kind of changes they might implement into the game and what we can expect them to add, and just hopefully keeping the spirit of the game intact. But without further ado, let's talk about some Dead Rising. Dead Rising is a zombie open-world sandbox game where you can use pretty much anything and everything to kill massive hordes of zombies that get in your way, while being stuck to a timer so you can get to all of the story beats and get to the bottom of the truth behind the outbreak at the Willamette Mall. We're going to discuss the plot of the story, so spoiler warning will be in effect, but before we go forward, if you enjoy this video, please hit the subscribe button and let me know what you think down below, because I want to hear your thoughts on Dead Rising and everything relating to Dead Rising. Dead Rising follows Frank West as he's trying to get his next big scoop. In 2006, Frank is alerted to some big newsworthy story going on in Willamette, Colorado. This brings him to the Willamette Mall, where a deadly virus has taken over, turning people into zombies. Frank arrives in a helicopter while scoping out the town and just seeing what the situation is all about. He sees people getting attacked, falling off of rooftops, the whole nine. It's a very violent and gruesome scene. Frank then has to jump from the helicopter and land on the roof of the Willamette Mall. While his helicopter gets chased away by the military, Frank then meets Carlito Keys, who talks like an edgy high school boy and doesn't really give Frank that much information. Carlito eventually leaves Frank to his own devices, and this leads Frank to the entrance of the mall, where a bunch of survivors are held up trying to survive, and they're blocking the door up to keep the zombies out. Frank goes to help the survivors block the door, but the old lady looking for her dog opens the door, letting the zombies in and basically killing all of the survivors, and this forces the survivors to have to push back to the security room. So here I want to mention a little bug in the game that I like to exploit sometimes when I don't feel like playing the main cases to the story. If you stay and fight all the zombies and run the time down a little bit, you'll be able to skip the main stories while being able to still save survivors and kill psychopaths. But I don't know, I just wanted to briefly mention that because I do that all the time, and I don't know if you guys knew about that. But when Frank gets back to the security room, he finds out that basically nobody made it, and the only people that are left are Brad, Jesse, and Otis, one of the security guards for the mall. Frank decides to leave the security room to try to find out more information as to what is going on, and while he's doing this, he runs into Jesse, who tells Frank that Brad has gone after the man responsible for unleashing the virus. After agreeing to help Brad for information, Frank starts to head towards the food court to find Brad getting attacked by Carlito, and it turns out that Carlito is the guy responsible for unleashing the virus. After saving Brad, Carlito is wounded and he takes off. After the fight with Carlito, both Brad and Frank discuss the events of what's going on at the mall. Brad doesn't want to work with Frank because Frank is a journalist, but he decides to work with Frank once he finds out that Frank knows where the man that they are looking for is. And that's Dr. Barnaby, who Frank saw in one of the stores at the main entrance. This leads Brad to open the gates connecting to the main entrance mall so they can go find and talk to Dr. Barnaby. Brad talks to Dr. Barnaby, but Dr. Barnaby refuses to come out of the store unless they have a direct safe route out of the mall. Frank has a helicopter coming in 72 hours, so they decide to use that as a bargaining chip to get him out. But before they can go get him out of the mall, Dr. Barnaby is kidnapped by Carlito. Now, Dr. Barnaby was a scientist turned informant for the DHS who called and warned them that a terrorist was about to unleash the virus, and the virus was unleashed, and he wanted a way out because his safety was at stake, with the professor knowing that Carlito knows that he was the scientist behind Santa Cabeza. Dr. Barnaby is caught by Carlito and hung out for bait for the zombies, while Carlito is taking shots at Brad and Frank with a sniper. Once they defeat Carlito, he runs off. Brad shoots Carlito and Carlito shoots Brad and wounds Brad, and Brad is unable to carry Dr. Barnaby back to the safe room, so Frank has to bring both of them back to the safe room. Once we bring both of them back to the safe room, Jesse sedates Dr. Barnaby and lets him sleep in the little side room that's next to the monitors. Brad is discovered to have a fever, and Frank needs to go get medicine to treat that fever. This is where we run into our first story psycho. Well, at least one that's not Carlito. This is the grocery store clerk, Nick. Once we kill the clerk, Isabella wakes up from his shopping cart and then runs off, and Frank is able to get the medicine for Brad. When Frank returns with the medicine, Dr. Barnaby starts going on a rant about Santa Cabeza, which leads Jessie to privately talk to Dr. Barnaby and try to get more information out of him. She ends up kicking Frank out of the safe room so she can talk to Dr. Barnaby without any cameras. This leads Frank to try to track down Isabella so that he can get more information about Santa Cabeza and why that has to connect to the Willamette incident. Frank finally tracks down Isabella, and this leads to a motorcycle boss fight in which Isabella is thrown off of her motorcycle and Frank tries to talk to her about Santa Cabeza. When he finally subdues her, he tells her that he's just trying to help her, which then she finally agrees to talk to him. Instead of her talking to him, she recommends that he sets up an interview with Carlito. Carlito knows a lot about the zombie outbreak because he was the one that started this outbreak, and it's supposed to be a message to the US government in regards to the experimentation with the zombies in Santa Cabeza. After Frank talks to Isabella, Frank heads back to the safe room to talk to Dr. Barnaby about Santa Cabeza. He tries to say that the outbreak was started because of drugs. He says that the cartel was mass producing these zombie-turning drugs, and that is what started the outbreak at Willamette. Frank doesn't buy this, however, and heads to go interview Carlito so he can get more information. This is where we run into Isabella, who has been wounded by Carlito after Carlito shoots her for asking about an interview with Frank. Frank then picks her up and then drags her back to the safe room to safety so that she can avoid being turned into a zombie. This is when Jessie is attacked by Dr. Barnaby, who is starting to turn into a zombie, and Dr. Barnaby finally spills the beans about what happened at Santa Cabeza. I just love this right here because Frank just straight up fucking kicks this dude in the face. But, yeah, so he starts to talk about what happened in Santa Cabeza and that they were experimenting with zombies to mass produce livestock because of the amount of beef that Americans were consuming. So instead of creating cattle livestock, the US government accidentally creates zombie livestock, and it's a little unclear to me if they were using zombies as a substitute for beef or not. That part isn't really clear, but Dr. Barnaby does turn into a zombie, and it is unknown at this point, but Dr. Barnaby actually infects Jesse with the virus during the struggle. While Dr. Barnaby is turning, Isabella starts to talk about how the outbreak started in Santa Cabeza, and it was started because the queen wasps escaped the laboratory and started infecting the townspeople. After the outbreak had started, the army was called in and they had wiped out the entire village. This was the reason behind Carlito's infection of the Willamette Mall, so he could get his revenge for what happened in Santa Cabeza and the testing with the zombie experiments. After Isabella shares this, Dr. Barnaby turns into a zombie and then is shot by Brad. So because of his interaction with Isabella, Carlito decides to start his next plan, which is blowing up the mall. Frank and Brad have to stop him from doing it because it'll release the virus into the air so that it can affect surrounding areas and states. Frank then sets out on disarming all of the bombs that Carlito has planted. Brad chases after Carlito, but Carlito is able to get the upper hand against Brad in a fight, and he locks Brad in a room full of zombies, killing him in the process. Frank is then able to collect all of the bombs and disarm them. He brings them outside so that it doesn't blow up the mall. Frank afterwards goes after Carlito, who has been caught by a big psychopath butcher, who Frank wants to get his fresh meat, and the butcher will not give him his fresh meat unless it is ground beef. Carlito is mortally wounded and he ends up succumbing to his wounds, but before he does that, he tells us that it isn't over. Apparently his last plan was to infect orphans with various time bomb viruses that will set out to infect millions, causing a mass outbreak in the United States. Before Carlito dies, he gives Frank his locket. This locket helps Isabella finally lift the jammer so that Jesse can finally contact her headquarters, and unfortunately, the headquarters informs her that the government wants to deny all knowledge of what happened at Willamette and at Santa Cabeza. Frank decides to head back to the safe room, but when he gets back to the safe room, he hears gunshots, and Frank finds out that the military has arrived and taken the survivors. But before they could leave, an infected Jesse attacks and kills 2 of the military personnel before they could leave. In the confusion, Otis, the security guard, steals a helicopter and flies away. This is around the 72-hour mark when Frank's helicopter is supposed to arrive. Frank then heads back to Isabella, who tells him to leave and that she is not coming with him. Frank then leaves to get to the helipad where he sees his pilot flying towards him, and as he gets closer, the pilot is then attacked and killed by a zombie that snuck onto the helicopter, crashing the helicopter. Frank is completely out of options, and so he drops to his knees as the zombies approach and the credits roll. And this all depends on the ending that you get for doing certain things in the game, but the canon ending is going into overtime. Isabella makes it to the helipad as Frank is about to get attacked and saves him, but Frank passes out. When he wakes up, he finds out that he has been infected, but if he's able to collect different materials around the mall and then tend queen wasps while also avoiding the military, he might be able to make a temporary cure. Frank then kicks into action, collecting everything he needs while avoiding the military at the same time. He collects the samples, and Isabella is able to create a suppressant to stop his infection from spreading. While Frank was out, he discovered a hidden path in the clock tower that is full of zombies. When he informs Isabella, she is able to make a zombie repellent so that they can get through the tunnel and to a Humvee. They follow this path in before arriving to fight the final boss, who is chasing them in a big tank. The military captain has become set on completing his mission in any means possible. His orders are to kill everyone and everything. The tank autopilots, arming itself to fire at a group of zombies, and it distracts the captain just for a second so that Frank can jump on the tank and start fighting him in hand-to-hand combat. After a brief scuffle, Frank is then able to knock the captain off of the tank into a pit of zombies and stops and screams at the sky before finally escaping the zombie outbreak with Isabella. This is just one of the many different endings you can get depending on how you played the game, which makes this game so great. Not only is the story amazing, but all of the different things that you can do in the mall to either explore or kill zombies adds to the fun and the enjoyable experience. I originally tried to play this game after Dead Rising 2 had come out, but as a young kid, it was just way too difficult for me. I was finally able to beat it 10 years after starting it for the first time, and I've beaten it so many times since. I personally enjoy this game more than I enjoy Dead Rising 2 and 3, but we'll briefly talk about those games in a minute. So for a game that was made in 2005, there are going to be a lot of different things that don't age well with modern audiences, but this game seems to have held up really well to the test of time. Besides for its difficult combat controls and the campy nature of the story and the characters of the game, the first two sequels after its release slowly started to let go of some of the game mechanics that made this game great, while also innovating on a lot of its weaknesses. I'll talk about what I mean about the sequels in a minute, but let's just take a moment to highlight some of the big things that this game did very well. The 72-hour time clock that you are provided with throughout the game basically gives you a time constraint to do most of the story missions and forces you to have good time management. Do you want to save a group of survivors, or do you want to fight different psychopaths, or do you want to fight psychopaths and save other groups of survivors? These are the types of questions that this timer forces the player to ask themselves. Now, the way that the timer fits into the story itself is that Frank has a helicopter that is supposed to arrive in 72 hours to pick him up and help him escape. So he needs to get to the truth before this happens. This is something that makes the pacing of the game work really well too. Now, saving survivors, although is very tedious, it's one of the main side quests that you're given throughout Dead Rising 1. It's the option to save multiple groups of characters and escort them back to the safe room. This gives you a chance to level up your character with PP. Leveling your character up will provide you with more inventory space, health slots, and some cool new moves that you can use against the zombie hordes. Also, saving survivors will give you the PTSD, because God help you if they get caught in a horde of zombies, you'll never get the word Frank out of your head. The incessant crying the survivors do will never fade away from your memory either, as that shit after 2 playthroughs becomes extremely annoying. Nonetheless, it is extremely beneficial to save these people, as it becomes very rewarding for your character. Also, the AI was really bad, so it added to the challenge and the charm of the game. Another big thing that was memorable were the psychopath bosses like Adam the Clown, the Butcher, the grocery store clerk, and the goddamn escaped convicts that respawn. Even after 15 years of playing for the first time, I still can't get over the gruesome deaths of some of these bosses that are burned into my memory at this point. Fighting these bosses were great because it allowed you to get an arsenal of weapons that would help you navigate the horde of zombies that get increasingly difficult as the game goes on. That and most of the deaths add to the silly humor of the game. I actually went back and played through the game again and discovered some bosses that I didn't even know existed, so I thought that was pretty cool. Now, as fun as these features were, you would start to see a lot of these features either get turned into something that would completely remove the charm of these games, or features that would end up being completely removed from the games as a whole. And that's where we get to the sequels. Dead Rising 2 and Dead Rising 2 Off the Record did a very good job at keeping what made the game good, while adding to some of the core mechanics, making it a lot more fun, but of course, eventually you would start to see almost all of these key features start to fade away with each new game. Dead Rising 3 tried out some new things that were fun in its own right, but the game definitely didn't live up to its older brothers. Dead Rising 4, however, turned into being that creepy uncle that your parents tell you to stay away from. Let's talk more about these sequels and why some of them aren't regarded as good as the originals. Dead Rising was such a smashing success, so a sequel wasn't out of the question. Capcom knew that this game had a lot of potential, but they wanted to hand the reins to a Western game developer, so they handed it off to Blue Castle Games, which would in the future turn into Capcom Vancouver. I honestly never knew about Dead Rising until Xbox had a promotional free games for gold that would change every month. That's how I got into the franchise. My first game started with Dead Rising 2, and this game followed a completely different main character from the original game. The main character's name was Chuck Green, and he becomes the hero of Fortune City, which is a casino and a Vegas strip mall. But the story of Chuck didn't start there, as he had a prequel game that was released later on, but in Dead Rising 2, Chuck Green was a part of a game show called Terror is Reality, which was the only way he could afford to pay for Zombrex, a medication that was sold to help these afflicted people with the zombie virus after there had been more outbreaks since Willamette. During one of the shows, another outbreak occurs, and he is framed to be the person behind it. It is later discovered that the plan had been orchestrated by TK, who was the host of the show. Terror is Reality and the company Phenotrans were the company behind the creation of Zombrex. TK mainly was after the money, while Phenotrans wanted to increase the production of queens, causing the virus. They also wanted to create more demand for Zombrex. They did all of this just to leave Chuck as the fall guy. He is eventually able to get his story out because of a reporter, Rebecca Chambers. Even though she is killed, Chuck is able to contact her studio to tell them his story, and the game ends with multiple endings, and an overtime sequence, depending on the different choices that were made by players. Dead Rising 2 Off the Record, which is an alternate timeline where Frank is the hero of the game instead of Chuck, it basically has the same story but with a few tweaks in the main plot. I can cover this in another video if you guys enjoy this video, but let's move on to Dead Rising 3. Dead Rising 3 released during Xbox's new console generation. The Xbox One and this game was not that bad, besides for the removal of some of the key features that created a small identity crisis for the franchise, with this game taking place in a whole city instead of just a mall, which made a lot of these old features more difficult to do because of the size of the map and the amount of zombies. The game takes place in Los Perdidos, and you play as a mechanic named Nick Santos, who is trying to build a plane or refuel a plane to get his friends out of the city before it is firebombed. The game does a very good job in tying up old plot threads while paying respect to its predecessors. There was a lot that changed in this game that many fans of the franchise did not like. For starter, the psycho fights became map markers instead of a surprise, which kinda took away the fun of defeating the psychopaths to begin with, and having combo weapons stored in lockers made it really easy to cheese the bosses with no problem. The story was overall a lot darker and gritty, but it was still very enjoyable to play, especially because it made killing zombies fun, because you could combine vehicles. Dead Rising 3 made for a much better game compared to Dead Rising 4, which we'll talk about now. Now, Dead Rising 4 is just terrible. It's bad. I don't want to get into it more than I have to, just because I want to focus on the best of Dead Rising, but I have to go into some details so you guys can get an idea as to why the franchise is where it is now. So, prepare yourselves. Dead Rising 4 basically brought back the beloved Frank West and made a mockery out of him, and this pissed a lot of fans off. Not only did they remove basically everything from the original franchises, but they did it in such a fashion that it destroyed any little bit of credibility the game had left. Capcom Vancouver basically ran the franchise into the ground. They removed all of those amazing features I had mentioned earlier, while keeping the weapon combo system and the locker system. The story itself was absolute garbage as well. The game was completely announced out of the blue and was spun into a Christmas game like what DC had done with the Batman Origins game, and they made you pay money just to see how the game was supposed to end. In the original games, if you'd done everything right, you'd go into overtime mode and you would get the true ending, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. They also made Frank's character out to be this out-of-touch loser, and they replaced the original voice actor, which removed any sort of resemblance to the character that anybody fell in love with. The game had mixed reviews, and there was a planned Dead Rising 5 that would have taken place in between Dead Rising 2 and 3 that would have taken place in Mexico with Chuck Green and his daughter, Katie, but that of course was cancelled when Capcom Vancouver was shut down. They shut Capcom Vancouver down because of the poor sales of Dead Rising 4. You can still find footage of the alpha game design on YouTube if it hasn't already been copyrighted like my video was when I posted it last year. There's a lot more that I can get into with Dead Rising 4, so if you'd like to see me do a video on that, please let me know in the comments section, because there's just so much wrong with this game that I can make a whole 45-minute video discussing all the issues. Now, let's get into the interesting part, and the part that I'm really excited to talk about. So, finally the main topic of what I wanted to talk about today. The possibility of a Dead Rising remake has not been a big secret since the Resident Evil titles have had such massive success. Capcom asked fans on whether or not they'd like to see a reboot of the franchise, and they did this in a survey back in February, where they asked people whether they'd like to see remakes or sequels to some of the fan favorite titles, like Dead Rising, Mega Man, Okami, Dino Crisis, and other fan favorite games along those lines. The fact that Dead Rising was mentioned brought a lot of fans a lot of hope, and it shows that Capcom has not forgotten about the beloved franchise. This and the same fact that multiple known leakers of Capcom's biggest franchises have come out and said that there was a reboot in development over at Capcom. A reliable source leaked the news back in May of 2023, stating that Capcom was in fact working on a reboot and that he couldn't reveal more. We can finally confirm the remake exists because the trailer just dropped on June 27, 2024, which showed a quick teaser of the introduction cutscene from the original game, with the voice actor that sounds unfortunately like the man who voiced Frank in Dead Rising 4. Why they decided to do this, especially with all the backlash, I have no idea, but another key detail that sticks out about this remake is in the title, Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster. Does this mean that there's more to this game than just the remake? We have no idea. This could just be a start of another collection of remakes like the Dead Rising collection they did back in 2018, where they did a remaster of fan favorite titles and ported the game to PlayStation so that it was no longer an Xbox exclusive. As of right now, no official release date has been announced, but it's likely that we'll see more information at Gamescom or at the Game Awards at the end of the year. I know the original game was single player, but another question I have that lurks in the back of my mind is, will there be co-op? Because so many of the other Dead Rising games had it, so I could see them adding it into this game as well. I don't know how I would feel about that because it wouldn't be sticking to the original game, but we'll have to wait and see. I'm disappointed that we didn't see anything Resident Evil related this year, but I sure as hell will take this instead. I'm glad Capcom is listening because this game deserves more attention than what it got when it started to crash and burn with Dead Rising 3 and 4. It was sad to see where the direction of the franchise went, but I do have a list of demands for Capcom if they decide to add anything new into the remake or touch up the remake with something other than that was in the main game. Now, things I would definitely like to see in the remake is Capcom going back to the basics. I don't want to see the same hand-holding they did in Dead Rising 4, because the challenge of what made Dead Rising such a unique and complicated game is that if they added the same kind of hand-holding, it would completely ruin the original concept of the game. And a lot of the hand-holding they had in the other games after Dead Rising 2. I also want to see that they bring back saving survivors and add more survivors into the mix. I hope they get rid of that cruddy system they had in games after Dead Rising 2 where the survivors were just side quests they added in for you to save, just to have them give you a crappy item and run away. Just to have them get killed minutes later too. Dead Rising 3 and 4 added this in, and it ruined the whole purpose of saving survivors, and made the game lack any kind of challenge, and removed the unique survivors you would always remember for their goofy character design, and turned them all into the same survivor getting saved 30 times. I understand the map size played a huge part in the change, but most of the time I ended up driving right by them because it was a huge waste of time. Another thing I'd like to see is that they add more to the map, like more levels to the mall to make it bigger. I know they did this in Dead Rising 4, but I would rather see them do this in a way that adds more to the game and gives us more tools to play with. Not only would this give us a chance for more survivors, but we might even be able to get more psychopath bosses for the game. The last big thing I would like to see them add are the game modes with longer time limits, like 72-hour mode being the basic story, and maybe a 120-hour mode added for more story and chances at grabbing survivors and killing psychopaths. This would add 2 more days to the original timeline to play around with, and add any new stories they want to add in. And obviously overtime mode has to come back as well, and I hope the sandbox mode comes back too, because that made Dead Rising off the record a lot of fun to play with a friend. Even if they don't add this, I still want to make sure that that timer comes back, because removing that was the worst thing the franchise ever did to itself. So this game would be amazing to bring back right now because of the silly and absurd tone that the franchise gives off. Most zombie games are normally very sad and serious, and this game allowed you to dress up like a toddler and beat the shit out of some zombies, which makes it a great game to pass the time. These games also did a very good job with satirical humor. As one of Dead Rising's antagonists, Carlito Keys, will tell you, this all happened because Americans would do anything to avoid eating less beef. We'd rather lose the entire state of Colorado instead of going vegetarian for a week. Dead Rising also has a spot-on commentary on American consumerism, and it's one of the only parts of Dead Rising that has aged well. If anything, we're more aware in 2024 that our lifestyles aren't just killing us, but in a lot of ways they've been weaponized against us. There's a lot of hidden themes in Dead Rising's zombie apocalypse. It's a world built on greed that is perpetuated by class war, and we see this through Frank West's desperate attempt to become a celebrity. That could hold a mirror up to our current culture. All of this perfectly shows the dark side to the culture in America, and it's amazing that this game managed to come up with something that would stay relevant 20 years after its release. This is something that fits so well in the modern age where the internet has turned into a battleground for who can get the most views and who has the most followers. I imagine that the reboot can realign the story with the same kind of ideas to make it relevant to the modern climate. We see a lot of these same ideas in Dead Rising 2 with conspiracies that the government is willing to infect people with viruses just so they can make money off selling the cure to the disease. This is something that a lot of people believe. I mean, they believe this about cancer, that companies would rather make money treating the disease than making a cure. Releasing this remake now will bring Capcom a truckload of cash with a lot of sales because it would bring fans old and new and add to the list of amazing Capcom remakes. Dead Rising will always have a special place in my heart because not only were the games fun to play, but they had great storylines that made you so excited to progress into the next part of the game. I feel like Capcom has learned the do's and don'ts when it comes to remaking games, especially after the mess that was Resident Evil 3's remake, so I have faith that they'll do a very good job regardless of what they decide to add to this game. I'll keep my finger on the pulse and try to update you guys on new developments as they come in, but I'm sure we'll hear a lot more as the months go by. That's all I have for you guys. If you enjoyed this video, please watch another one, because that's how the algorithm works, and if you like my videos or subscribe, this could be recommended to somebody else who likes this kind of content. I would eventually like to build a community that enjoys watching the stuff I create, so I don't know guys, thanks for watching, and until next time, have a good night.